Well, Christians are obligated to obey the Ten Commandments. And what we find in the Ten Commandments are the laws of God. And what we find in Jesus' interpretation in the Sermon on the Mount is that the standards of the law are much higher than we had assumed. It's not just not committing adultery and not murdering and not stealing, but Jesus says in interpreting the Sixth Commandment that if you harbor bitterness, if you're unable to forgive people, if you call them raka, that is to consider them a non-person, then you've murdered that person in your heart. He also says that if you lust in your heart, not merely engaging in the act of adultery, but if you lust in your heart, then you're breaking the seventh commandment. And if you're being greedy or if you're materialistic and you're not radically generous. So Jesus raises the awareness of the commandments to the highest level. And we also find from Luther's writings when he says that you cannot break the rest of the commandments without first breaking the first one. And that is that you are looking at other things as your ultimate value and your God, besides God himself. And he also said that when there is a negative prohibition in the Ten Commandments, that a positive implication is assumed. Therefore, that if you it says that you ought not to murder, it also means that you ought to radically love others, even neighbors and enemies. And when it says that you ought not to commit adultery, the assumption is that you're supposed to be faithful to your wife or to your husband, or to recognize sexuality as something that is beautiful gift from God. And therefore you ought, if you're in a marriage relationship, to recognize that it is a covenantal commitment between a man and a woman. And when it says that you ought not to steal, the understanding is that you ought to be radically generous. So this is the responsibility that a Christian has in responding to the Ten Commandments. But the problem here is that we're unable to obey them perfectly. So how are we going to resolve that tension? Well, Jesus Christ, who is the second Adam, who is the true Israel, who is that individual, divine corporate head and representative, who has come to fulfill the obligations of the law perfectly in himself, that obedience and righteousness now gets imputed into our lives, and therefore giving us the ability to be able to obey the obligations and the demands of the law. Even when we don't obey them perfectly, we know that we are not going to be crushed by the law, and we will have confidence in the desire to obey the law of God because we know that Jesus Christ has fulfilled those requirements perfectly for us, and therefore that we can do it without fear, that we will not receive the favor from God through our disobedience or lack of obeying perfectly, but we know that Jesus Christ has accomplished all these things, fulfilling the requirements of the law perfectly for us.